talk about how to test two population means if we have matched or paired samples. It's section 10.4 in your textbook, and we're going to start off with an example here. Consider a scenario where a sunscreen manufacturer wants to test the quality of their product. They have a test group to receive their product, and another group gets a placebo. However, can you think of a factor that might affect their results that this experiment does not control for? So just something to think about here. Um, we talked in the previous section about comparing two population proportions. And we said, is the proportion of whatever in this group different from the proportion of whatever in that group, right? So one of the examples was about side effects with Nasonex, right? And so it was we gave the drug to a bunch of people in one group, we gave them a placebo in the other group, and we said which group had issues, right? And then if we see a bigger difference in the drug group, then we say that yeah, that this drug potentially has a certain side effect, right? And then you dive down the rabbit hole of is that side effect, palatable given what the drug can do, et cetera. And that's its whole other thing. But that was kind of the general setup we had. And here we say, well, let's just extend that same scenario, but instead of working on proportions, we work on means. What exactly the mean is in this example is kind of irrelevant how they're measuring it. But we just point out here, can you think of a factor that might affect the results? And so this is the idea that what if one of the groups of people has people from different races that get burnt differently, and or the measurement of how they get burnt might work out a little bit different. What about different ages of people, right? Different ages get burnt at different rates. What about different genders, right? So you kind of start thinking through, there are a lot of factors that this experiment may not control for. The idea is if you control for everything perfectly equally, then any difference in the groups has to be because of the difference in treatment, right? The one group got sunscreen and the other group got either placebo or industry standard. And so this is a scenario that it's not the end of the world in this case, but it's just something to consider. Do we have similar groups? And can we ensure that we have similar groups, right? What if people are more in the shade or more under an umbrella or all these different things that we'd have to try to really control for and think about that we want to have all these things equal in our groups to be able to definitively conclude that the sunscreen is what's causing people to hopefully get burnt less. And so we note here that an improvement over this design is to sunscreen one half of each person with one product and the other half with the other. This eliminates a lot of issues because when someone's laying out at the beach, they typically aren't laying on their side. They typically aren't laying half under an umbrella, half under one. They're, any issue with the person, whether that's age or gender, race, anything like that, is taken care of because it's the same person. And so you can see how this would eliminate a lot of these issues, and that would be an improvement. However, we have something to be concerned about because the sample groups are now dependent on each other because they are performed on the same person. So now the data, we basically, we put the sunscreen on the right half and the industry standard or the placebo on the left half. What happens on the right half is dependent on what happens on the left half. Remember what the definition of dependence is. If you want to pause and go back, you can. But thinking back in chapter 3, when we talked about dependence and independence, independence means if you know what happens to something, it has zero effect on what happens to something else. Dependent doesn't necessarily mean something caused it, it just means it has some effect. It's going to change up things a little bit. And so if you get burnt on the right side of your body, that doesn't mean you will get burnt on the left side of your body now. It just means it's going to affect, you're more likely to now because apparently you might be just a person who's more sensitive to the sun. Or if you don't get burnt on the right side, now you're a little bit less likely because now apparently you have a little bit more resilience with that. Or maybe you just weren't out in the sun long enough, or whatever the case may be. It's whatever happens on the one side tells you a little bit of information about the other side. Again, doesn't cause anything. It's not deterministic. It's not, well, we know the answer. It's just it affects it a little bit. That's all we mean when we talk about dependence. And so we're going to kind of flesh that out a little bit more here. Again, ideas we've already talked about. Just want to look back to them because they're very important for this chapter. Make sure we're all on the same page. Two samples are independent If the individuals selected for one sample do not dictate which individuals are to be selected in the second sample. And so what that means is if I take a group of people and I have an independent sample, it means that that group of people doesn't tell me anything about who the next set of people is. The next set of people is just other people, and I don't know anything about them, or computers, or chairs, or whatever. It's just the samples are independent. If once I get the one sample set, the other sample is just more of them, but I don't really know anything else. Or to contrast that with dependent samples, where dependent samples are where if we select individuals from one sample, that tells us who or what is in the second sample. I selected a bunch, right half, left half, right? If I do the right half, left half idea, once I put the sunscreen on your right half of the body, you literally know all the individuals in the other half, the other sample, because it's the left half of the same people. Or if I select purposely, if I select, all husbands in one sample, then that would be, am I picking all wives in the second sample? Those would be dependent, as opposed to if I had independent samples would be like saying I just took a bunch of TWU students in one sample and I just took a bunch of other TWU students in the second sample, right? And it could be gendered even, right? It could be I took a bunch of male TWU students in the first sample and a bunch of female students in the second one. Just because they're different groups doesn't mean I know who's who. Now, if I specifically were talking about one sample is roommates who are younger in age, oh, well, then the other sample could be roommates who are older in age. And now they're, I have a deterministic pattern of who else is in that sample, right? And that's what we call a matched or paired. You'll see those terms used often and interchangeably. It's that, do you have a natural pair? Okay. And not to say that independent samples, people in them don't have pairs. It's just, is the other part of the sample their pair, right? Because we all have pairs. We could be attached to another person if we create some form of a relationship, right? Whether it's significant others or friendships or parental or whatever it may be, we have people we could say are our matches, but is that the person in the other sample or not? So, for instance, I could be in an independent study and I can be in a dependent study, right? In a dependent study, I have to have a pair, whether it's a friend, a cousin, spouse, child, parent. There has to be someone that's paired with me. Not to say that those pairs don't always exist. They always do exist, but in an independent study, there's no pair that I have. There's just other people that have other characteristics as in the other sample. Okay. And so we have some examples to go through this just to determine which ones are independent and dependent. So here's the first one. A researcher and his associates want to determine the effectiveness of a new medication. They randomly divided 430 subjects into two groups. Group one gets the medication, group two gets a placebo. Notice there's no way to pair these people. It's just 430 people into two groups. So because there's no way to match them up, these would be independent samples. Next one, in an experiment conducted in a biology class, professor measured the time required for 12 students to catch a falling meteor stick using their dominant hand and non-dominant hand. The goal was to determine which one is faster. And this would be a dependent study. Why is that? Because once I ask every student to do it with both hands, each person has a pair to match with. The pair for my right hand is my left hand. The pair for your right hand is your left hand. Doesn't even matter which one's dominant, which one's not. It's just that each one has a pair that it matches with. Sociologist wishes to compare the annual salaries of married couples. She obtains a random sample of 50 married couples in which both spouses work and determines each spouse's annual salary. Again, this would be dependent because each person has a pair. And again, I want to make sure we understand there are married people in independent studies. So this isn't to say that if you have married people that it's a dependent study. It's if one group is all husbands and the other one is all of their wives, specifically so they're partnered, that's dependent, right? And I can have a similar stuff that's independent. I can have an independent study where group A is all husbands and group B is all wives, as long as they aren't each other's spouse. That's independent because yes, there's husbands and yes, there's wives, but how would I pair them if they're not each other's husband and wife? And so it's this idea that if there's husband and wives and they are each other's husband and wife, boom, there's a pair that's dependent. If it's just one group of husbands and one group of wives, but they're not each other's, then there's no way to pair them, because how do I know which husband to pair with which wife when they aren't each other, right? There's no way to naturally pair them. So in this case, because it's 50 couples, that means that we have one of each and we know how to pair them. That makes them dependent. In the last example, a researcher wishes to determine the effects of caffeine. She randomly divides 100 adults into two groups. Group 1 drinks some caffeine, Group 2 drinks a placebo. They taste the same, so they don't know what group they're in. 30 minutes after, we do a series of tests meant to measure reaction time. And this would be independent because there's no way to pair those adults off into groups. So what this section and the next section are going to be about is how do we test two means, but we have to always ask ourselves the question, are the samples that these means are interested in independent samples or dependent samples? This section is how do we handle the dependent samples. The next one is going to be how do we handle the independent samples. For the dependent samples, your lives are super simple because a two-sample dependent test works the exact same way that a one-sample means test works. So I'll say that one more time, make sure you understand this. A two-sample dependent means test operates the exact same way that a one-sample mean test works. How does it work? What we are going to do is we're going to take each sample, and because each observation in the sample has a partner, we're going to subtract one from the other to create a third group. Okay, so this is how this works. We're going to have two, say, columns in Excel, and we're going to make a third column in Excel that is the difference between the two groups. Which way we subtract is irrelevant. It's just like we talked about last section. It doesn't really matter which way you subtract. What matters is your consistency. If you do group 1 minus group 2, that's the way you're setting up the problem, and it needs to be interpreted in that lens. If you do group 2 minus group 1, then that's the way you're interpreting it, and everything needs to look through that lens. That'll tell you if you're making sure that you have right tail, left tail. In those one-tail cases. So you just have to make sure you're consistent and think through the logic of that. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to subtract one column from the other column. So we're subtracting first, and then we're going to find the average of that third column. The first two columns go away. We can just delete them. We don't need them anymore. Okay, so we're going to subtract one column from the other column, get me a third column. That's the differences column. And everything it works is a one sample test on those differences. Then I just do the same averaging that we had done before. Ignore the first two columns. And we're going to contrast this with next video. When we talk about independent samples, it'll work the other way. We're going to do averages first and then subtract. So it'll work opposite in the independent case.